Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Secretary Mayorkas. I'd like to discuss with you the H2-A visa program, whereby, as you know, agricultural workers can pursue a visa legally to work in the United States to support the production of food in our country. And this is a program, of course, that's extensively utilized by our agricultural sector, important for our food security. But last year, a federal investigation called Operation Blooming Onion uncovered that some farm workers who were in the country through the H2A visa program legally to work had been subjected to human rights abuses and labor conditions so severe and inhumane that the Department of Justice deemed them to constitute modern-day slavery. So I sent you a letter on March 1st, 2022 to ask you to reform the administration of this program to ensure that farm workers legally with an H2A visa entering the United States would not be subjected to such appalling and inhumane treatment. And you responded, and I appreciate your response, just a couple of months later, and informed me that you would, in fact, undertake such reform and that you'd begun a rulemaking process to do so. So I'd like to ask you for an update, please, on that rulemaking process and on the department's efforts to ensure that workers in the United States through the H-2A visa program are not subjected to these crimes and this catastrophic treatment.
Senator, thank you very much. So two things. Number one, the rulemaking is underway, I believe, and number two, and I can provide you with a more specific update after this hearing. But critically, or I should say, and critically, we have revised our worksite enforcement strategy for precisely the reason that you identify, precisely because of what we observed in Operation Blooming Onion and tragically in other circumstances as well. Our enforcement resources in the worksite environment are focused on investigating and prosecuting employers who exploit the vulnerability of the migrant workforce by paying them substandard wages, by keeping them in substandard working conditions, not only exploiting the vulnerable workers themselves, but also creating an unfair advantage in the marketplace, because through those conditions, through the imposition of those conditions, they charge lower prices and create an unfair competitive advantage. So it is unscrupulous employers upon whom we are bringing to bear our worksite enforcement authorities.
Will you please provide my office with an update? Will your staff please provide my office with an update by the end of this week on the expected date for completion of this initial rulemaking process?
Yes, and I should say that the worksite enforcement strategy that we announced several months ago is already underway. It does not require rulemaking. It is a matter of using our enforcement authorities and resources most effectively, and that is how we are doing so.
Understood. Continuing the discussion about the H-2A program and considering in particular the small and medium-sized farmers and growers who utilize it, recognizing that the various elements within DHS have significant resource constraints and a lot of work to do, including ensuring the fair and humane treatment of workers under this program. DHS has proposed dramatically increasing the application fees charged by USCIS for a variety of visa programs, including for H-2A and H-2B petitions, whereby employers could see increases of up to 250% in a single year. And of course, we're in an environment where farmers are facing high fuel prices, high fertilizer prices, and where Americans are facing high grocery prices. So my question for you is, in developing this proposed rule and the increase in fees for USCIS for H2A and H2B programs, have you consulted the Department of Agriculture? And is there some accommodation that can be made to ensure that there are not crippling fees imposed upon small and medium-sized farmers who are having a tough time right now?
So, Senator, if I may, so the fee rule to which you refer is an effort to try to get U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services back on stable financial footing. A fee rule, the adjustment of costs for immigration benefits, is supposed to be revised every 2 years. A fee rule has not issued for more than 6 years. So that agency was decimated in the prior administration, and the reason for the proposed significant increases in certain costs for certain benefits is by reason of that fact and the need to actually infuse much needed funding for that agency. It is not a rule that we promulgate unilaterally, but rather it is in the proposed rulemaking stage. We are receiving comments in response to it, and no final decisions have been made.
Good. Well, I want to urge you to consider the economic circumstances of those small and medium-sized farmers in particular, with such a sudden increase in the fees they rely upon, the fees for the visa services that they rely upon. Let me ask you about DHS detention practices. As you know, I led an investigation in the Permanent Subcommittee of Investigations last year, whose findings were deeply disturbing, indeed horrifying. This bipartisan investigation I led with Senator Johnson of Wisconsin found that female detainees in DHS custody detention in Georgia were subjected by a DHS-contracted doctor to excessive, invasive, and often unnecessary gynecological surgical procedures, including, in some cases, without informed consent. In November of last year, during a Homeland Security Committee hearing, you committed to me to review the findings of that investigation. We made a number of recommendations in our report accompanying that investigation, expediting and improving vetting of off-site medical providers, and dramatically strengthening the procedures by which you ensure that DHS detainees have the opportunity to consent or not to medical services. What steps have you taken since that investigation?
So, Senator, thank you very much for the report that you and Senator Johnson led. I did indeed review that report. As I think you know, we closed the facility that was the subject of that investigation. I did direct that the recommendations be reviewed and implemented to the fullest extent possible, and I'd be very pleased to get you an updated report of the status of that implementation.
Well, I think that's urgent, and I want to get that information as soon as possible. We're talking about women convicted of no crime in the custody of the U.S. government being subjected to gynecological surgical procedures that were not medically indicated, often without informed consent. It's one of the, and I do want to state for the record that this appalling activity occurred prior to your tenure, so there's no mistaking for the public tuned in here right now. But it is completely unacceptable that practices may persist that leave women in detention at risk of this treatment. And I'm sure you agree with me, Mr. Secretary. I want an update on what you're doing to address it. And finally, I want to talk to you about your Office of Intelligence and Analysis.
Yes, and we are addressing that with due urgency because of precisely how appalling that conduct was and what was going on in that facility. We closed that facility.
I know you did, and I want to make sure that there are practices being implemented across DHS detention facilities to ensure that can never, ever happen again. So I look forward to that update. I want to ask you about your Intelligence and Analysis Office. There has been recent reporting about problems at the DHS Office of Intelligence and Analysis. I don't think that the Congress has sufficient visibility into its activities. Among the conduct alleged in this public reporting, with respect to domestic intelligence gathering by the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, interviews with individuals in detention centers, local jails, and federal prisons without counsel present. That was one of the allegations made in public reporting. This is deeply troubling, and I don't think that there is very intense congressional oversight of this office. Is there a problem? What are you doing to address and identify the problem? And what does the Congress need to know?
Senator, the Office of Intelligence and Analysis is led by a phenomenal public servant in Ken Weinstein. He's the undersecretary. He has a tremendous experience. He was the Homeland Security Advisor to former President Bush. When you speak of the interviews of individuals in custody who are in the pending legal proceedings, he suspended that practice. It was a practice that was implemented first in the prior administration. He suspended that practice, and he is really doing a phenomenal job in ensuring that the practices of INA, the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, adhere to our laws as well as to our fundamental principles of protecting the civil rights and civil liberties as well as the privacy
Were there
interests
interviews of U.S.
all
persons?
individuals.
Were there interviews of U.S. persons in federal prisons or local or state jails without counsel present by INA personnel?
I believe that there were, and that was not necessarily always improper, but the practice was suspended because of concerns with respect to it. But I must say, Senator, that the personnel of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis are incredibly dedicated and incredibly principled in the execution of their responsibilities.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my questions today, I do want to express my